Everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel titled Current Perspectives in on Trade in Food and Agriculture. My name is Anna Helm, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Center for International Business Education and Research at GW-CIBER at the George Washington University School of Business. As part of my role as faculty in our International Business Department, I currently teach the undergraduate consulting course, Foreign Market Analysis. Every spring semester, students in this course work in consulting engagements with firms interested in internationalizing their operations. Thanks to a wonderful collaboration with Shawn, Jarosz, today's moderator, and a group of other international trade professionals, including our impressive panelists featured in today's event, this semester we have been working on devising export strategies for US firms in the food and agriculture industry. Today's event was born out of this collaboration and is intended to help students in my foreign market analysis course and others in our audience today gain a deeper understanding of current issues in food and agriculture trade. Before I hand it off to Shawn, let me say a few words about GW-CIBER, which is one of 15 prestigious CIBERs around the country supported by the US Department of Education. A broad mandate is to increase the competitiveness of US firms abroad. The event today is one of many outreach events we host every year. Together, the CIBERs around the country form a powerful network focused on meeting the demands of US firms for competent, globally minded talent and up-to-date knowledge about international business. Let me now introduce Shawn Jarosz, founder and chief trade strategist actually at TradeMoves. Shawn has worked in international trade for nearly 25 years, managing global sourcing, supply, and customs issues on behalf of US companies. Since founding TradeMoves in 2006, she has focused on serving clients in the processed food and consumer product sectors on their global trade priorities and initiatives. Shawn is a licensed US customs broker, certified customs specialist, and cleared advisor to the US Trade Representative on trade issues affecting US small and minority businesses. We are so proud to count her as one of our alumni from the MBA program at the George Washington School of Business. Please join me in welcoming Shawn, who will be moderating the discussion for with our distinguished panelists today.
Thank you, Dr. Helm. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends out west. It's a pleasure to be here moderating the current perspectives on cross-border trade issues in the US food and agricultural sector. I wanted to go ahead and just briefly introduce our panelists. I believe everyone has received their bios, so we won't take up too much time, but I think it's important to recognize them and thank them. And I am delighted to be here with these four women. They're women I greatly admire. They are all experts in food and agriculture. They are all passionate about trade, and they work daily at the intersection of trade operations and trade policy on behalf of their members. Because the bios have been shared in advance, I'm just going to talk just quickly about each one of them. Alison Boder, and this is in the same order that they will speak. So Alison Boder is the CEO and president of the American Frozen Food Institute. She's a longtime client and friend who has worked with exporters and importers most of her career. And I know that with many of us in COVID, I don't know about you, but the percentage of frozen food that I have purchased over COVID pandemic really makes me realize the importance of the frozen food industry. Second speaking will be Lorena Alfaro, our executive director of the U.S. Agricultural Export Development Council, which is made up of USDA cooperators. Those are trade associations and state and regional trade groups that receive USDA funding to support U.S. exporters of food and agricultural products around the world. I'm pleased to have gotten to know Lorena this past year, and she's introduced us to many different USDA cooperators, and I appreciate the fact that she also introduced us to our next speaker, who will be Suzanne Schreiner, who is the administrator of the Synergistic Hawaii Agricultural Council, which is a USDA cooperator. Suzanne is also a second-generation Kona coffee farmer, and I appreciate the fact that she, again, works at this intersection of trade operations in her own farm and export operations as well as trade policy. And she's really the whirlwind who brought us 3 Hawaiian companies to work on this project with Dr. Helm in her FMA course. Finally, I very much appreciate that Sandra Benson is here. She's the Vice President for Market Access and Regulatory Affairs with the U.S. Dairy Export Council. The U.S. Dairy Export Council is also a USDA cooperator. Sandra is a former colleague. We worked together for many years. She's a current client. And although she did not write it in her bio, I'm pleased to say that she's also a GW alum that is a Wolcott Fellow. So having had her master's paid for by the Wolcott Fellows at the GW Elliott School. And then again, I'm Shawn Marie Jarosz with TradeMoves. And thank you to Dr. Helm for hosting this, I think, important discussion. So more than $335 billion in food and agriculture crossed US borders in 2019. And despite COVID, more than $350 billion in 2020. We import slightly more than we export, and that's because we're meeting US consumer demand. But our exports, if you look on par, they're pretty close to our exports. And our topics are timely. We have Alison talking about the trade and food safety and the impact of COVID on food supply chains. We're then going to pivot to Lorena talking about the fact that USMCA is now has been implemented, and we're getting close to a year in. There's still many barriers in Mexico for US food and agriculture exports. And there's been some barriers for imports from Mexico, and talking about the importance of that relationship. Despite having an FTA, there's still many barriers. Then we're going to pivot to Suzanne talking about the perspective of exporting from an island and the unique challenges for important markets for exporters from Hawaii. And then finally, rounding it out will be Sandra, who will talk about those barriers to US exporters of dairy products. I tell people, if you can export dairy products around the world, you can probably export any food product around the world. The amount of regulations and barriers to US dairy products, I think you'll get a good sense of that once Sandra does her presentation. And then we'll do a wrap up with Q&A. And please put your questions in the chat box, and I'll moderate those questions for us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn it over to Alison Boder for her to start the presentations. Thank you. Alison, you're on mute today.
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm so pleased to be here with you. What I'd like to do, I'm going to talk about COVID and how that's affected the frozen food industry. But I thought I'd start with a little bit of an introduction about frozen food generally, my association, and some of the trade issues and how trade affects my industry. And then I'll give you some examples of pretty relevant, timely issues that we're working on. And then I'll finish up with some comments on COVID. So AFI is the acronym for the American Frozen Food Institute. I'm the president and CEO there. We represent about 100 manufacturing companies who produce frozen foods. And the breadth of our companies ranges from small family-owned farms that plant, harvest, and freeze commodity fruits and vegetables to very large private or internationally held companies like ConAgra or B&G or Schwann's that produce more complex value-added frozen foods like Chinese entrees, chicken pot pies, soups, breakfast items, anything that you would see as you stroll down the frozen aisle of your grocery store would be considered eligible for membership in our association and are the types of products that my companies produce. We've been around. Frozen food, really the freezing technology was started in the late 1940s, early 50s. So it's a relatively new industry. And technology has changed a lot over time. More recently, we're using technology called IQF, or individually quick frozen, and that's really revolutionized the frozen industry. It allows us to freeze items individually and then pack them together, so the quality is enhanced greatly. If you think back to when you were young, you might have gotten that square block of peas or spinach in the freezer. That's because that's how we used to freeze them in blocks. And now you buy a bag of frozen spinach and you get individual leaves or parts of leaves. So that's a pretty intensive technology. but it's one that is really represents kind of how we process food today. So in the US, frozen foods the consumption of frozen foods has grown considerably during the pandemic. Shawn mentioned that. When I joined AFI about 5 years ago, frozen food was actually at the tail end of a slump around consumption. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that consumers viewed frozen foods as kind of the frozen food of your childhood, that Swanson Salisbury steak, right? But over the last 5 years, our companies have done a lot of innovation, a lot of revamping of product. And that has really, the consumer has tuned into that. And then when the pandemic hit, of course, the demand for food at retail skyrocketed. And as consumers were moving away from trips to the grocery store, they were looking for options where they could store food longer and also have variety and convenience, because we were cooking every single meal at home. So frozen fit the bill there very well. Over time, I'm telling you that because the market for frozen food in the US is high. I mean, it's on a growth trajectory. Our core consumer is the millennial family with young kids. They're working parents. They are a values-based consumer, and they're also looking for health and convenience. So we expect the market for frozen food in the US to continue to grow over the next 10 to 15 years as these consumers and their families mature. So that puts a lot of pressure on our production. So it's a long way of getting to tell you about how we produce food and where food comes from to service the US frozen food market. We're actually more of an importing industry in frozen food. So we don't do a lot of export. And that's because there's so much demand and growth opportunity in the US. Most of our major processors, in fact, they are looking to expand their businesses and import as they grow internationally, take advantage of their base here in the US to bring additional food items into the US. When you think about produce, so of course, produce is a big part of frozen food. And it's a big part of our membership as well. With produce and with all of our trade, actually, China and Mexico, not surprisingly, are our biggest trading partners for import and export. With produce, we produce the majority of many fruits and vegetables here to service our own market. However, demand is exceeding what we can produce in a lot of commodities. Also, there's a play between frozen and fresh. So in the US, most broccoli, for example, that's grown in the US supplies the fresh market. So most frozen broccoli is actually imported as a frozen commodity, and most of that's coming from Mexico. Same for cauliflower and spinach. The majority of frozen product in the US is coming from outside the US. That's sold in the US. It's coming from outside the US. From Mexico, we're buying broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, and also strawberries, increasingly blueberries and mangoes. In the fresh fruit space, in the frozen fruit space, we're also, Mexico and Canada are our biggest trading partners. If you think about it, all tropical fruits, frozen fruits, are imported to the US. So pineapple, mangoes, papaya, etc. But increasingly, berries are imported into the US as well. Chile, for example, is our third largest importer of frozen fruit into the United States, and much of that is in the berry market. We have a very strong berry industry domestically that grows for the fresh and frozen marketplace. We have a wild blueberry industry in Maine, and then we have what's called a bush blueberry in other parts of the United States. And it's bush blueberries that are largely imported from Chile and Mexico and also Canada. So with that kind of background on who we are, I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that are topical for probably many in the food and ag space and how it's affecting our industry. When I talk about just about blueberries, well, there's some tension there between importers and those trying to export product into the United States and domestic growers. And some of you may be aware that, in fact, domestic growers requested that the International Trade Commission do a study on economic injury to the US marketplace, to the domestic growers from imported product. That study was done under, I guess, at the request of the Trump administration. And the ITC came out with their response earlier this year, and they did not find that there was economic injury to the domestic berry growers, probably much to the dismay of the domestic berry growers. But it just is an example of the tension that arises as trade increases. It really creates a lot of pressure on domestic sources, especially if, you know, the classic case, imports can be produced at a lower cost. And with produce, that's certainly a possibility, especially when produce is hand-picked. In the US, our labor for hand-picked product is quite high. So another area that we're working on is GSP, trying to get the general system of tariff preferences. I mentioned that we import a lot of broccoli from Mexico. Well, we also import broccoli from Ecuador, but right now it doesn't benefit from GSP tariff rates. So we're paying a higher rate for broccoli from Ecuador. So that's a goal also of our industry, our members, that all of the brands that you buy, and we sell, I should have mentioned this, our frozen food suppliers sell into retail, which you're all familiar with, but they also service restaurant industry and hospitality industry. So a lot of product gets brought into the United States that goes into a broader food distribution system. The demand for broccoli, is the #1 frozen veg, is very high. So our importers are always looking for alternative sources. So that's an area, that's something that we're working on. With free trade agreements, under the Trump administration, we saw a free trade agreement phase 1 with Japan. That didn't affect us, as it was okay for the frozen food industry. What it did not include for us, which we had hoped it would, was tariff phase outs to Japan for frozen blueberries. It did include fresh blueberries, but not frozen blueberries. So we were hoping to have a phase 2 to that agreement. It didn't happen under the Trump administration. So, and I don't, you know, it's a very, very low priority for President Biden. So I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. But for our domestic blueberry growers that freeze product, that's an important export market. One of the few areas where we do export is in frozen berries, and then we follow some of our food service customers to Asia. For example, McDonald's or KFC, we sell frozen product to support those businesses, frozen corn and potatoes. And berries have been very successful abroad. And I guess for us, we don't have the most sophisticated or experienced exporters in our industry because we've been focused on the domestic market so much. And one of the products, or one of the case studies that you're hearing about, Pacific Valley Foods, our other member companies turn to specialists like Pacific Valley Foods to help them grow their export markets. So anyway, that's a little bit of an overview. I also wanted to mention retaliatory duties. We're often caught up in retaliatory duties. So trade issues that are completely unrelated to the frozen food marketplace, but we are added as commodities on tariff retaliatory lists. And that was the case in the recent Airbus Boeing dispute, and also with imports from China. We do not export as much to China, some in frozen fish and berries, but we do import some frozen veg, some specialty veg, and those all got caught up and are still caught up in the China retaliatory duties. So a little bit about COVID. I want to talk about two things briefly, and I'm happy we can address more in the questions, but there are two issues. One is, but they both revolve around really less food safety and more worker safety. So China has been concerned, has expressed concern about COVID transmission on frozen food surfaces, frozen food packaging. And they've made great attempts to control the narrative around the origin of COVID into China, claiming that that a very possible theory from their perspective is that it could have entered China from frozen food surfaces. There is no data to support that. There is no evidence. We do not know of any cases where anyone has contracted COVID from a frozen food surface. But nevertheless, China has started to require additional sanitation steps on all imported frozen food products. And most of that is frozen proteins like seafood or meats. But it comes at considerable cost to the exporter trying to get into China. And China, in fact, is trying to push that through the WTO. We have been working as an association with our federal agencies, asking them to push back on those measures because they're so costly and because there's no evidence that those additional sanitation steps are needed. At the same time, we're also concerned as that narrative emerges out of China, nowhere else, but we see media stories about it, and we're very concerned that the consumer will start to believe that frozen foods are not safe, despite the fact that the evidence is to the contrary. So that's another issue that we've been, working on, and it shows how trade and geopolitical issues affect trade, and then also can affect the marketplace in another country. So we've worked very closely with USDA and FDA to make sure that they reiterate the safety of frozen foods and the lack of any evidence to support the theory that COVID is transmitted on frozen food surfaces. And we've been very successful at that so far. And we've also contracted a study out of Emory University to help us really do a quantitative risk assessment of what is the likelihood of COVID transferring from a frozen food surface. And we will be making that data available to FDA and CDC and our global trade partners so that we can provide perspective on those theories. So it's an interesting example, though, of how, how COVID has really affected our ability, or I guess our focus around food and worker safety. And then on top of that, of course, COVID, when it was in the last year, in the midst of COVID, our supply chains were severely disrupted, particularly in the beginning. Getting the credential of being considered an essential worker was a task that was foremost in the beginning of the year for us, to make sure that our workers could get to work and could continue to produce food. But that also included workers in our supply chain. And then it included workers at the ports to be able to offload ships and transport product to our facilities. So over time, those supply chains have certainly rebounded. But one of the lasting outcomes from that is that our members are pretty adamant now about diversifying their supply chain. So whereas if they had one supplier from China or even from Chile in the past, now our members are looking to have suppliers from China and Chile and Canada, so that if one source is blocked, they can still have access from other sources readily, because that was a real barrier back in March, April, May for us with relating to COVID. So let me stop there. That's kind of a big overview, but I did want to share, again, some basic issues that we work day to day, and then kind of this big picture of COVID right now. And we can answer questions later during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Alison. I think you've hit it on the head. There's, the food safety aspect, and you've hit on many of the regulatory barriers we're hearing from other sectors as well on packaging and so forth. So thank you. And I know I've got some questions I want to ask you. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lorena. as Lorena brings up her screen, she'll be talking again about Mexico, US-Mexico agricultural trade. Lorena, you may be muted, and I know you're going into presentation mode here soon. So I'm going to mute myself.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So can you see the screen?
Yes, and you can go ahead and go into presentation mode.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'll be speaking about Mexico and our agricultural trading relationship with Mexico specifically. And to put my remarks in context, well, it says start my video. Okay, never mind. As long as you can see the screen. All right. So first, just briefly to put my remarks in context, I wanted to share some visuals in the form of graphs and charts to illustrate the strength of our agricultural trade relationship with Mexico. And within this context, I will then discuss some trade barriers or potential trade barriers that are causing concerns for my members in the agricultural export sector. Because despite the gains that have been made under NAFTA, now USMCA, and the strong trading relationship that we have forged with Mexico, differences remain in the national regulatory regimes that can create behind the border trade barriers, as we'll see later on. So let me forward. I keep getting a, all right, let me try to escape here because I can't advance. And I'm getting okay, here we go. Great. All right, sorry about that. So as you can see with this slide, since the early 1990s, the US-Mexico relationship has been a robust one. We've grown exports to each other's country. The red line here, as you can see, represents agricultural imports from Mexico to the United States, while the blue line represents US exports to Mexico. You can see that both countries have experienced sustained growth over the years in value terms. And over to the right, we have some specific stats there in terms of the market share that we comprise for Mexico and vice versa. US-Mexico, the trading relationship is a largely complementary one, meaning that the United States exports different commodities to Mexico than Mexico exports to the United States. So it's a very complementary comparative advantage type of relationship. About 3/4 of US agricultural exports to Mexico are grains, oilseeds, meats, and related products, as you can see. And about 2/3 of US agricultural imports from Mexico consist of beer, vegetables, and fruit. These imports are closely tied to Mexico's historical expertise in producing alcoholic beverages and a wide range of fruits and vegetables, and to Mexico's growing seasons, which largely complement those of the United States. For example, many types of produce that the US does not grow in the winter are grown during that time in Mexico. However, this robust relationship has not been without its hiccups, and we have experienced many bumps along the way, and we still do. And so I will discuss some trade barriers that we are currently experiencing with Mexico, and then conclude with some issues some measures that we in the United States have initiated against Mexico, and then open it up for questions at the end. So I'll start with the potato ban. It's a long-standing issue that goes back to 1996, when Mexico first restricted the importation of fresh potatoes and limited it only to the 26-kilometer area along the US-Mexico border. So this dates back to 1996. Several agreements have been reached since, but for one reason or another, Mexico has failed to fully comply with their ability to provide market access to potatoes. In 2014, for example, the Mexican government agreed to allow US potatoes full access to their market and went as far as publishing new import regulations for potatoes. However, Mexico's domestic potato industry sued the government of Mexico and initiated a number of legal cases challenging those regulations. The cases made their way through various courts over many years, with one case eventually arriving before the Mexican Supreme Court in 2018. The case is pending a ruling now by the Mexican Supreme Court, and we anticipate a ruling tomorrow. So be on the lookout for news tomorrow as to whether Mexico will allow fresh potatoes into their market. So this Supreme Court ruling will establish either a path forward or maybe the potato industry might have to bring a dispute case through the dispute mechanism in USMCA. Front of package labeling. This is a measure that Mexico recently initiated, which establishes the labeling regulations for packaged foods and non-alcoholic beverages. It's a scheme requiring warning signs regarding nutritional content and calls for black stop signs to be used to alert consumers of products that exceed critical nutrient thresholds, such as fats, sugars, sodium, etc. There are also various marketing and advertising restrictions with respect to advertising of these processed products to children. For example, you can't use certain characters or certain toys or certain celebrities. One of my members' company had to remove bunny ears from their candies in order to have the ability to sell those products in Mexico. So exporters are concerned that these measures, which in certain areas appear to lack a sound scientific basis, are exacerbated by a government campaign in Mexico that is seeking to curtail U.S. food and agricultural imports, branding them and other foreign products as detrimental to Mexicans, to the health of Mexican consumers. I'll turn over to the organic certification issue. One of my members, the Organic Trade Association, was informed late in December that Mexico would begin requiring all imports of organic products to be certified to Mexico's organic standard by the end of 2020. That was by the end of last year. So my member had less than 1 month of notice, and luckily, we've worked very closely with the US government, and Mexico has extended a deadline until June 26th for all imports of organic products to be certified to their standard. But this is an extraordinarily short time for implementation. If the policy is enforced, US organic producers will experience significant trade disruptions, as certification can take quite a long time, can take over a year or more if if organic companies are mandated to be certified. And there's a lot of ambiguity about the scope of the products that need to be certified and which parts of the supply chain need to be certified. So there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. I will say that Mexico is the second largest market in the world for US organic exports. And Mexico imports about $117 million of organic goods, or it did in 2020. In 2019, it was somewhere around 190 million. Next, I'll move over to I'll address glyphosate and biotech generally at the same time. But I'll begin with the decree that was issued in December 31st. So New Year's Eve, this last New Year's Eve, the Mexican government issued a presidential decree stating its intention to phase out the use of glyphosate. And as you know, glyphosate is the ingredient in the herbicides that manage and kill weeds and so forth. So while the phase out is unclear and we're not certain where, how this will be implemented, this creates a significant cross-border trade barrier for corn products and other row crops that are used in feed products for Mexico, destined to Mexico. As far as biotechnology, Mexico has not approved any applications for authorization of ag biotechnology products intended for use in food and feed since May of 2018. And so there is a concern that Mexico is stalling and is not moving forward with the applications that can promote new technologies and therefore new products into the Mexican market. But I will just end in the next 2 minutes by saying that there are a number of other regulatory labeling or customs issues that we are facing with Mexico. But the US is not without its own protectionist tendencies either. So I will conclude by just pointing out several measures that have been initiated against Mexico. And we are all aware of the tariffs that were imposed on aluminum and steel originating from Mexico. In 2019, we initiated a dumping case against imports of tomatoes from Mexico. And most recently, we've also initiated an investigation against blueberries from Mexico. We know that these are Mexico's, main exports of fruits and produce and agricultural, vegetables and products such as these. So I just wanted to point out that we in the US are not with our own issues. And so it's a strong, thriving relationship, but not without its hiccups and tensions. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Lorena. I appreciate it. And I think you've hit it on the head. I've got some questions for you about how these agreements, how we've seen some progress from what the US has done in terms of imports from Mexico, but that there are many barriers still for US products. So thank you very much. And we're going to turn to Suzanne. And while Suzanne is bringing up her slides, Lorena, you can turn off your slide and we'll go from there. Thank you, Suzanne.
Morning, everyone. It's nice and early here in Hawaii, so I'll just get right into it. Going back up, I'm with Synergistic Hawaii Ag Council. We actually are a consortium of 3 products: coffee, papaya, and the floriculture industry. Hawaii is a small island. We have a thriving ag community, but since we are smaller, we came together to form some synergies to really drive the message of aloha. Because what we're selling is not just a product, we're selling a vision of Hawaii. And it pre-sells our products, which makes it very easy to market because everyone has just this perspective of Hawaii. They want to visit, they want to come, they want to enjoy our products. But we have a lot of challenges because we are a small island. So the first part I want to talk about is the price of paradise for us as growers. Now, we think of the trade balance. We think of imports and exports. In Hawaii, it's very focused. Nearly everything we bring in is an import. All of our inputs, whether it's gasoline, whether it's food, whether it's fertilizer for our crops, whether it's the lime and the coconut as a tourist when you come for your Mai Tai, this all comes from outside our islands. You can see the price of milk on the right-hand side on sale right now for $4.99 for a half gallon. What a deal. Our prices are very high. What this does on the outside is it drives up the prices of our exports. So when we compete in a global marketplace, we compete partly on price, we compete partly on reputation. And we have to bring all of this together as a Hawaiian commodity group to promote the best vision we can for our exports. And when I talk about exports, it's not just to a foreign country. From Hawaii, everything that goes to the mainland US, we also consider an export. We have challenges going into California with some of our products because of their tight rules. Of course, we have challenges with foreign trade too. But let me jump into, back up, one of our commodities, and you'll hear in the breakout session more from one of our coffee farmers. But Hawaii coffee, when you think of Hawaii coffee, you generally think of Kona coffee. It's our #1 brand throughout the state. It's one of the top brands worldwide when it comes to coffee. And one of our key export issues is counterfeiting. You can go anywhere in the world and buy Kona coffee, and I can almost guarantee you it's not actually Kona. Sometimes they call it a Kona roast. Sometimes they call it a Kona blend. But this is an issue as a trade group we have to fight on the global market, is reining that counterfeit brands in. We also have a lot of other coffees in Hawaii. Big challenge raising those brands. For example, I'm sure you've probably never tasted a Ka'u coffee, which is a neighbor right down the road from Kona, but it's an excellent coffee. But that's part of our marketing end, is raising the profile of all the coffees to match that Kona brand. And interestingly enough, the bullet point at the end, most of our coffee, as most of our products do, because we're shipping on boats, nearly everything goes to LA or San Francisco, gets put into a big warehouse, and then is re-exported. So most of the coffee from Hawaii is actually sold out of California. Floriculture, one of our top brands statewide, and it's not a food crop, but my floriculture guys call it food for the soul. You can see these tremendously beautiful cut flowers here. You won't see this in an average florist shop. For example, the crab claw heliconias on the right-hand side of that picture. If you walk into the Bellagio in Las Vegas, this is where you're going to see them, is one of those large, huge, beautiful flower arrangements. So they're very distinct, very striking. Once again, very expensive to produce. And so our challenge in the floriculture industry is finding the market for this. When you export a cut flower, they have to go through all sort of phytosanitary protocols to make sure we're not exporting any potential insects or pathogens, a fungus or anything like that. So there's a lot of paperwork requirements. We have to dip these products before we ship them out. The other aspect of the floriculture industry is you walk into a lobby of an office building, for example, you'll often see potted palms, decorative palms. Hawaii is one of the top producers of those. They go for thousands of dollars each, but because it's in a soil-based medium, very challenging to export, very difficult to export into Canada because they don't want to take a chance there's anything in that soil. So these are one of the negotiation points with our trade reps, is try and smooth that out, make sure that we're not exporting something that's going to be problematic for the country that's receiving it. What I'm going to focus the rest of it on is on papaya. Now, Hawaii has a rags to riches to rags story with our papaya. It's been a very challenging industry. Our papayas are some of the best in the world. Right now, most of our papaya is, interestingly enough, a genetically modified product, partly because of that and partly because of some other external issues. The industry is under great stress. 2018, we lost most of our papaya fields in a lava flow. Some of the challenges of Hawaii don't happen elsewhere. And COVID has also been a tremendous burden on us. The reason papaya is primarily genetically modified at the moment is because of what you're seeing on the screen here. Is in the 50s, we started developing a viral pathogen on a lot of our papayas. It's called a ring spot. You can see it here. Doesn't do anything to the inside of the papaya, but it makes the outside ugly and unsellable in the marketplace. Sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, this ring spot mutated and became, just instead of one single spot, it would cover the whole papaya. By 92, it was clear we were going to lose most of our papaya farmers. USDA got involved. The scientists began working on some gene splicing to put essentially a vaccine within the papaya that would kill that virus. By 1995, our entire papaya industry was gone. By 98, the scientists had received approval to market and breed the GM papaya. It actually tastes equal, if not better, to the non-GM papaya. And we started growing papaya again. It took 6 years of lab safety to get the GM papaya through. But in 98, our industry started to come back. Once we had our industry back, we started focusing on other countries. And Japan market had been a tremendous seller of papaya before we lost it to the ring spot. So we spent 10 years working with the Japan government on food safety to get the rainbow papaya able to be sold in Japan. We were successful. In 2011, we re-entered the Japan market, but they required us to stick a GM sticker on the outside of that papaya, which really hindered sales. As you all know, GM is very controversial, right or wrong. We could have a lot of discussion on that, but the label on the papaya scared away a lot of our consumers. So in 2013, we switched to focusing on the Chinese market. I'll put this up here now. So to do that, we had a lot of discussions with the Ministry of Ag in China. They agreed to let us begin a lab testing in China on food safety for this. We shipped a container of papaya to Beijing to begin the lab testing. The scientists there didn't have all the appropriate permits to import this papaya. And so this container of papaya sat on the port for about a week. And if you can think of a bunch of fresh fruit in a hot container, it did not end well for those papaya. So we had to reorganize our paperwork, ship another container out. The lab in China grew out the papaya from the seeds. They fed the fruit to rats. We had about 3 years of studies. They determined on their end, by this point, we're about 19 years into food safety studies. They determined the papaya was safe. So they gave us a permit that stated the papaya was safe, and now we could begin talking about exporting. We haven't even gotten to the export yet. So in December of 2019, we got the great news we had received approval to export to China. But 2019, what are we in the middle of with China? A big fat trade war. It was not a good time to receive that permit. It was also right on the cusp of COVID. So that was just the first step, the receival of that permit. We also have to get a bilateral agreement through the US trade relations. And that's where they sit down with China, work out the details of actually exporting, making sure that the phytosanitary considerations are met, and everything that goes with exporting a fresh product, we're meeting all the standards. So right now, almost a year and a half later, we're still waiting for that bilateral agreement. Papaya is a minor crop, and USTR has a lot of bigger issues to deal with corn or soy when it comes to China. So we're still kind of on the sidelines, waiting to finish out this feel-good story. But it's been a long road, about 20 years with papaya since we first lost our industry. And the feel-good part of this story is GM crops get a lot of abuse. But really, we had about 1,000 growers that went out of business because of the ring spot virus. And GM is the reason these 1,000 growers are back earning money, exporting to the US and globally, because we were able to recover from that with the vaccine. So with that, I know I'm over my time, so I'll wrap it up and I can answer any questions later.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's very helpful. And we're going to go ahead and extend. I'm taking the initiative here to say we're going to extend about 10 minutes so that we can hear also from Sandra and then still take questions. I think these presentations are fantastic and we're getting a lot of information, and I want to make sure we can open it up. So we will extend. The panelists will be going into breakout sessions with the students later, so we have the ability to stay on a little longer. I do now want to turn it over to Sandra, and while she's bringing up her presentation, I just want to make the comment that's to build on what Suzanne said about the fact that, you know, genetically modified has had such a bad rap, but the fact that it spurs on innovation, and innovation because of genetically modified shows the importance, I think, that this has had. And I know that there are some markets, like you said, China and others, that remain closed and closed-minded. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. But Sandra, I'll turn it over to you. And we can see your notes page, and whenever you're ready to go into slide presentation. There you go. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shawn. Very happy to be here speaking with the students and anyone else who's interested in the topic. I am Sandra Benson with the U.S. Dairy Export Council, and the U.S. Dairy Export Council is a trade association that helps our members export dairy products around the world. I'm going to be talking about regulatory considerations, but first wanted to look at the dairy export potential, because of course the first step in evaluating whether or not to export is to see if the demand is there and also the supply. Starting with the demand, I think it's important to note that dairy demand has increased in recent years as populations around the world have grown. And it's also important to remember that 95% of the world's population lives outside the US. There are a lot of countries that don't have significant dairy production, so what we've seen is a rise in imports, and that presents an opportunity for US dairy exports. And from 1995, when the US Dairy Export Council was formed until last year, exports were up 735% by value and 523% by volume. So you can see trade has really grown. There's also good opportunities because the supply has grown. We're seeing a growing gap between domestic production and consumption. And now that we've seen that the supply and demand checks out, we'll move on to the regulatory aspects. There's some regulatory considerations to make. I've listed 5 here. I'm sure there are many, many more, but we'll focus on these 5 today. The first one is to ask whether the market is open to US dairy exports. Second, are there any prohibitions? So the market may be open, but can I market my product in this country? Third, we'll look at cost. What are the import tariffs and how does that impact my competitiveness? Fourth is process. Are there any pre-registration requirements? So are there steps I need to take before I can export? And 5, we'll look at the regulations and the impact of the domestic regulations within that market. The first example, and I have 5 examples for each. The first example we'll look at is with Russia. Is the market open to US dairy? And I picked Russia because it's the world's largest importer of butter and cheese last year. However, the market is not open to exports of US dairy. The most recent action relates to the Russian annexation of Crimea. So in February 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. In March 2014, the US began to impose sanctions. The first sanctions were imposed in March, but there were others. And then by August 2014, Russia applied sanctions to the US. And those sanctions covered lots of food products, but butter and cheese, as well as most dairy products. There's no indication that these sanctions will be removed anytime soon. Of course, relations with Russia right now are not great. But even if they were lifted, it's important to note that the market was actually already closed. It had closed in 2010. The Russian government wanted a list of plants that meet Russian requirements. Of course, the US attests to plants meeting US requirements. So that market is closed, and it has been now for close to 11 years. The second example we'll look at is, can I market my product? And for this example, we will look at shipping cheese to the European Union. And the reason we'll look at that is that member states in the EU rank in the top per capita consumption of cheese in the world. It's a great cheese market. There are regulatory considerations though. First, is the market open to US exports? Yes. Can I market my cheese in the EU? And the answer to that is maybe. Is the variety a protected geographical indication? So a geographical indication is a type of intellectual property for names that identify a product as coming from a specific region of the world. It's similar to a trademark, but again, focused on a region rather than owned by a company. Some of you may be familiar with champagne. So champagne comes from the Champagne region of France, and all other similar products are called sparkling wine. Well, the EU does the same thing with cheese, and only the GI holder can use that GI name. This slide shows an example of some of the protected names in the EU, just a couple of them, but these are the varieties I thought you might be more familiar with. If you look at the EU's geographical indications register, it actually pulls up 269 results. So not all of these are approved, some of them are applied, but 269, that's a lot of different cheese names. And all EU member states enforce these GIs. So for example, all feta sold in the EU can only come from Greece. And GIs may be broader than just the name. I have asterisks there by Parmigiano Reggiano and Pecorino Romano because the EU also includes a prohibition and using names that we might think are more generic, like Parmesan and Romano. So one of the most challenging aspects of the EU in using these geographical indications is that they're not actually a factor just in the European Union. What the EU has done is negotiate the exclusive right to use these geographical indication names in their trade agreements. And I have the example here with Korea. The EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Korean government has agreed to honor 4 geographical indications for cheese, which means that only those approved GI holders in the EU can export those cheeses to Korea. So the US can't now export Asiago, Feta Fontina, or Gorgonzola. The third example I have is a cost evaluation looking at the import tariffs. And for this example, we're going to look at skim milk powder going to China. And the reason is that China was the top importer of skim milk powder in 2020. Regulatory considerations here, again, we'll start with, is the market open? Yes. Can I market my milk powder in China? Yes, there's no GIs related to milk powder. Will the import tariffs make my products competitive? And the answer there is not currently. Here we've got a table with the current tariffs assessed on skim milk powder in China, on imports from some of the world's largest dairy producers, so the European Union, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. And there's 2 issues here to note. One is that Australia and New Zealand have free trade agreements with China. So currently the tariff from New Zealand is 0, which means Chinese importers don't pay any tariff on New Zealand origin milk powder. For Australian origin milk powder, the tariff is currently 4.2%, but that will be eliminated in 2026. There's a gradual tariff reduction scheduled through the free trade agreement. Imports from the EU are assessed the most favored nation tariff rate, which is the tariff rate that's charged to all members of the World Trade Organization unless there's a preferential tariff under a free trade agreement. The US, though, would be paying that 10% most favored nation because we also don't have a free trade agreement with China, but we're also assessed a 25% retaliatory tariff. And that tariff was implemented in 2018 after the Trump administration implemented tariffs on Chinese imports to the US. And these tariffs, retaliatory tariffs in China, then further erode US competitiveness. The next example I've got is the pre-export requirements. So you may be interested in exporting to a market, but it's really important to know if there are other requirements that you need to know about before you export, because there's sometimes a lot of steps. And I chose Indonesia because this is one of those markets that it's a great market. It's our top 10 export market for dairy. There are just a lot of steps you need to go through. So we're going to go through the same considerations again. The market's open to US exports. Yes, you can market butter there. What are the import tariffs? In this case, there's just a very small disadvantage. The most favored nation rate that the US and EU pay is 5%. Australia, New Zealand, again, duty-free because of a free trade agreement. Can I export without pre-registering? And I just use pre-registering as a generic term, but you'll see on the next slide all of the processes that are required. So starting with halal certification, Indonesia requires all dairy products to be halal certified, and companies that want to export to Indonesia must obtain halal certification. Second, you've got a plant registration requirement. All dairy plants exporting to Indonesia must be registered with the Ministry of Agriculture, and the process involves completion of a questionnaire. The current processing time, though, exceeds 1 year. That may change, it just takes a while right now. All imported processed foods also need to be registered with the Indonesian National Agency of Food and Drug. That registration process takes about 100 working days. And finally, once all these other processes are done, the Ministry of Trade issues an import permit. And obtaining this import permit is the responsibility of the importer. I included it here though, because it's important for exporters to know that ministry issues import permits for a 6-month period. So you can have your import permit for the first half of the year or the second half of the year. So you may end up, once you have all these other processes done, you may still end up having to wait before your importer can bring in your product. Finally, the example I'm going to show here is the impact of domestic legislation. And the marketing interest we'll have is cheese going to Mexico. Mexico is the top export market for cheese. Top US export market for cheese. Regulatory considerations though, yes, the market's open, obviously, if it's our top market. Yes, you can market unless it's a protected geographical indication. Again, it's a smaller list. The EU has a free trade agreement with Mexico that's negotiated but not yet implemented, and there'll be some additional protections once that agreement enters into force, although I believe there are a few now. Will the import tariffs make my product competitive? Yes, there's no tariff on any dairy imports into Mexico under the USMCA. Can I export without pre-registering? Yes, there are import permits needed, but they're available to importers at any time. It's not like Indonesia where it's only for 6 months at a time. And finally, are the domestic requirements advantageous? And here, there may be challenges with labeling if the regulation is implemented as expected. And I'm going to pick up something that Lorena talked about, which is the new front of pack labeling regulation. It was issued last March and began enforcement in October of 2020. And there are a couple of issues for exporters. One is the sticker allowance change. So Mexico has historically allowed sticker labels on imported foods, and that allowed US companies to use their English language label, and they could still export to Mexico, but the importer had to make sure that they sticker labeled the product prior to sale. The March 2020 labeling regulation allowed stickers for these new front of pack warnings that you can see at the bottom of the screen there for only 6 months, and then a permanent label would be needed. And that time frame was just extended for 2 months. But still, we're expecting the requirement for a permanent label to continue. And so then companies need to decide whether or not it's cost effective or something they want to invest in to create a label just for Mexico. And the next issue I'm going to talk about is the front of pack warnings and how that actually may impact cheese. So there are 3 phases to implementation, and the 3rd phase means that once one critical nutrient is added, so once you've added salt, which is the case when you're making cheese, all nutrients that exceed the threshold must be labeled even if they're naturally occurring. And on the next slide, I have some examples of what that might mean. And please note, these are just meant to be generic examples. Obviously, some soda, some candy will fit this example, some flavored milk, some cheese. It's not meant to be representative of every product in the market. But as you can see, in the 3rd phase of implementation, we would expect some soda and candy to have 2 warning labels, excess calories and excess sugar. Flavored milk and cheese could each have 4 labels. So for flavored milk, you could see sodium, sugar, saturated fat, and then a warning sign contains sweeteners not recommended for children, which, by the way, is required for all sweeteners, including natural sweeteners like stevia. Cheese could have 4 warnings: calories, saturated fat, sodium, and trans fat. So part of the reason that you see so many warnings is that the Mexican regulation is based on a standard size, standard reference range of 100 grams or 100 milliliters, regardless of the portion size of the food or how much is expected to be consumed. And we believe this type of system may cause confusion among consumers and are concerned that dairy may be negatively viewed despite its overall beneficial contributions to the consumer's total dietary intake. And although these warnings are meant to provide consumers with a quick at-a-glance assessment of the healthfulness of a food, the challenge we see from the dairy perspective is that these foods misrepresent nutritionally dense foods. And we don't yet know the impact of this regulation because the third phase is scheduled to be implemented in October 2023. So in conclusion, you can see from these examples that exporting presents excellent opportunities. It's just important to consider regulatory aspects in addition to marketing consideration. And finding that regulatory information is really important. U.S. Dairy Export Council provides it for our members, and the U.S. government is also a great source, and we work very closely with them. So appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Very helpful. I appreciate that overview. It's and I like the way you walk through that to show where the barriers were. We have a question, actually, Sandra, that is directly to your presentation. The question is, I'm wondering if the labels impact sales since they seem to be negative, and if there are 4 of these on every, it's going to, in my mind, it's going to be, you're going to be blinded to it, right? If everything has stop signs on it,
right?
Is it going to impact sales? Is it going to do what the Mexican government wants to do in terms of stopping? Has USDEC or any other industry associations, and maybe Lorena knows this too, have a sense of the impact that these will have on U.S. sales?
I'll speak for the dairy side, but I think others would like to jump in, as everyone's been paying close attention to this new regulation since it was drafted. I think we don't really have a full assessment yet because the regulation has only been in force for a little over 6 months. So we'll have to see. There are a lot of other countries, though, particularly within the Americas, that have implemented front of pack labeling regulations, though most of them are not quite as strict as Mexico. We have seen, for example, Chile has implemented a front of pack labeling regulation, and it did not significantly impact dairy sales, but then dairy would also not be viewed as less healthy than something like candy, based on the way that Chile set it up. So there is some variation in how these regulations are implemented, and I think we're all concerned about what will happen in Mexico in that phase 3 timeframe, and even now. But again, others may have additional comments.
Yeah, Lorena?
Sure. So it's my understanding that about 80% of food and beverage products in Mexico will be impacted, and that they'll carry at least 1 warning sign. I was also told that at the end, they're all, most of them will carry warning signs. Consumer will just kind of, overlook all of those warnings. But it is a significant amount of exports for the U.S. I believe the number I was given for 2020 is 6.4 billion in exports to Mexico. And, I have some figures on my slides as well.
Yeah, and I think the point there too is that it's not even that you can invest beyond the border. Even if you were to go into Mexico, sometimes you can get around a barrier by investing in a market. This is happening to, doesn't matter if you're a U.S. exporter, a foreign exporter, or a Mexican company. These are quite, we'll see if they impact sales and do what the Mexican government is hoping it'll do. I'm skeptical.
I'm sorry, Shawn, I will just add one caveat, and that is that Mexico is not the only country implementing these types of labeling regulations. So I want the students and everybody listening to be clear that these types of measures are also being implemented in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and especially we've seen UK, like you said, in Latin America, it's becoming a spread, and foods that you would normally consider healthy are being wrapped up. Alison, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say there's been a bill introduced in the US Congress to consider front of pack labeling. So it's here as well. It hasn't been implemented, but it's under consideration.
And front of pack labeling doesn't have to be onerous. It's when it's a warning label, when it's that you're at risk, when it's making that it's a danger to buy or consume this food. That's the concern, and if it's non-science based. having front of pack voluntary labeling, for instance, in the United States is something that has, I think, a lot of processed food manufacturers have taken on, but something that's going to be mandatory, in which it says a food is bad when you can't take it against a certain serving size, I think really makes it problematic. So I appreciate that we've touched on that. I think that's a big issue. I had a question for all of you regarding, I wanted to go back to sort of the COVID question. And, you know, you brought up, Alison, this question of China questioning whether or not food surface, you know, frozen food surfaces or packaging is COVID free, and how do you do that? How do you prove that? Also, I wanted to touch really about the labor force in COVID. So we're having, you know, if we're importing foods and we're exporting our foods and we rely on labor force to hand pick or process foods, what is the impact of the sort of the vaccination rate on the feeling that those who are going back into the fields as we're getting close to our harvesting season? Is there a sense from all of you who have worked, you know, you work with your farmers and your growers and your as to what we can expect? Are people getting vaccinated, and how is that going to affect the food supply?
Yeah, so I can start on that one. Really disappointingly, we're seeing about 50% of our workforce choosing not to get vaccinated right now, between 35 and 50%. So it's a pretty high rate, and that's a problem. You know, we need, in order to reach herd immunity, and in order to get back to lessen some of the mitigation strategies that are quite onerous in place for our workers, the full masking, the barriers. There are a lot of things that we've done in the food manufacturing facility or in the fields that to protect our workers, and that are going to have to stay in place until we have higher vaccination levels. But right now, we're troubled by what we're seeing. And, you know, right now, I think the prevailing assumption is that over time, those who are declining to get vaccinated will be pressured into doing so, or will be convinced that it's safe over time as they see their peers getting vaccinated. And that's our hope, that that's gonna take place. Otherwise, it's a real barrier to reaching that herd immunity.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing that as well, Suzanne, in Hawaii? Is there?
Yes, we have seen it to a certain extent. Hawaii allowed ag essential workers to get vaccinated early. I was vaccinated my first shot about 8 weeks ago, I'm very proud to say. A lot of our labor force is seasonal. And when you think of seasonal labor on the mainland, they move around very easily. Coming into Hawaii, they had to fly in at a time when we weren't really letting people in. They had to jump through all sorts of hoops. We had to get approval from the governor's office for our employee lists. And that made a lot of our typical workers just not interested in getting on a plane. First of all, it was scary to get on a plane. And second of all, to have to go through a permitting process where you provide all your paperwork to the government is very scary for a Hispanic worker. So we are hoping the vaccines continue, and that it makes it a little easier for them to travel in the short run.
That's yet another unique challenge, isn't it? So we are wrapping up time here. I'm going to do a lightning round. This is just one question that I'd like you all to answer. The fact that you've touched on high tariffs, COVID, non-science-based front of pack warning labels, counterfeiting, SPS issues, GMO barriers, geographical indications, sales, bans to minors, retaliatory tariffs. If you could say one thing to the Biden administration in terms of what is your number one priority, either an issue or a market, what would it be? I'm going to start with Sandra. And you're on mute.
Yes. To be honest, well, another department typically handles those matters, but I would say overall as a broad scope issue, obviously the retaliatory tariffs are a concern, but the evolution of non-science-based barriers to trade around the world continue to be a concern, and as we see some countries implement them, it is difficult to get them worked through. Exactly. So I will say that just generally is always a concern.
That's a good one. I'll go to Alison next.
Continued U.S. federal government engagement on COVID and supporting the strong science around COVID and food safety.
Excellent. Lorena.
If we were to say make one recommendation to Biden, you know, for the long term, I would, like, keeping my eyes in the horizon here, I would say joining the TPP or CPTPP. We've been put at a great disadvantage by not being a part of that agreement, and our competitors, you know, are moving ahead and we're being left behind. So it's time to join that agreement and level the playing field.
Perfect, thank you. And Suzanne, you've got the last word.
It's tough to add on to those. What I would probably say is to stop weaponizing our food exports in trade battles with other countries. We saw that with China, where really it was our farmers who bore the brunt of that, when perhaps the issue was more related to hard goods rather than food. And we just like to step out of it and go back to feeding the world.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. Thank you all for being part of this discussion. Everything you've talked about is something we all live with every day in terms of the roles we have to work with our members and our clients. Anna, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I hope your students and the GW trade community has appreciated this. I know we have to do our breakout sessions, but thank you, everyone.
That's right. I just want to concur. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. Great to have these questions and the lightning round at the end, just to get those last moments with the panelists and the last ideas. So thank you everybody for being here today. We are hosting many of these kinds of panels and other events for students, for the policy community, business community, as well as research initiatives. So stick with us, follow us on social media. I hope you can come back soon. And thank you so much for Shawn for leading this conversation. And for the students who are here in my class, let's now move to our regular classroom for a really exciting rotation where you can pick the brains of these amazing women experts in international trade. So again, thank you. Well, let's conclude for today.
Thank you.